Think anyone's still alive in there? Not after a storm like this.
The snow had swallowed the mountain trail. Not covered it. Not drifted across it. Swallowed it. Asher Rowe leaned forward in his saddle, narrowing his eyes against the stinging wind. Every few moments another blast of snow erased the tracks his horse had just made, as though the mountain wanted no witness to what had happened here. Behind him, his younger brother Bennett pulled his scarf tighter around his face. "We're losing daylight." Asher didn't answer. He was counting. Every ridge, every frozen creek, every familiar pine bent beneath the weight of fresh snow. They had ridden this route dozens of times over the years to visit Gideon Hale's mountain cabin. Today it felt like an entirely different world. 3 days. That was how long Gideon had been missing. 3 days since he'd ridden into the Bitterroot Mountains to check on a small herd sheltered in a northern valley. 3 days since anyone had seen him. By now, Silver Willow Crossing had stopped pretending otherwise. At Dinah Mercer's boarding house that morning, conversations had fallen quiet the moment the brothers entered. No one said the words. They didn't have to. Men who disappeared during a storm like this rarely returned. Pastor Edwin had already begun speaking about memorial prayers. Sheriff Hollis quietly offered to organize another search party once the weather eased. Even Marlowe Quinn, who had trapped these mountains longer than anyone alive, had simply removed his hat and stared into the fire. That frightened Asher more than anything. Marlowe never surrendered hope. Never. Yet today, he had. The brothers urged their horses higher along the ridge. The wind screamed through towering pines. Snow cracked from overloaded branches. Visibility shrank until even nearby trees looked like pale ghosts. Bennett finally rode beside his brother. "You remember what Gideon used to say?" Asher kept watching the trail. "He said a mountain doesn't care whether a man is brave. It only cares whether he's prepared." Bennett smiled sadly. He always had sayings. He had reasons. Neither spoke again. The silence between them carried years of friendship. Gideon wasn't simply another rancher. When Asher lost his first blacksmith shop to fire 8 winters earlier, Gideon had quietly arrived with lumber before sunrise. No speeches, no sympathy, just work. When Bennett nearly froze hauling wagon wheels through Deep Elk Pass, Gideon found him by following a frightened mule's tracks through waist-high snow. Again, no speeches, just action. The kind of man who appeared exactly when people needed him, which made this silence feel impossible. Near dusk they reached Eagle Bluff. Below lay Gideon's Valley. Bennett's heart sank. The cabin was barely visible beneath the snow. Only the roofline remained uncovered. There, Asher pointed. The chimney. Nothing. No smoke. No movement. No lantern glowing through the windows. The younger brother swallowed hard. "We're too late." Neither wanted to believe it. Yet neither argued. They urged their horses downhill. Snow reached nearly to the animals' knees. Every step became a struggle. By the time they reached the cabin yard, darkness had settled across the mountains. The front porch had almost disappeared beneath drifts. Asher climbed down first. His boots disappeared nearly to his calves. He slowly walked toward the front door. Bennett followed, carrying a lantern. Neither spoke. The silence felt sacred, almost like entering a church. Asher removed one glove before reaching for the frozen door handle. His fingers lingered there. For one brief moment. He couldn't make himself turn it. What if? His voice failed. Bennett rested a hand on his brother's shoulder. "We came. That's what matters." Asher nodded, then slowly pushed the door open. Warm air rushed outside. Not cool air. Not stale air. Warm. The brothers froze. The scent reached them first. Fresh bread. Beef stew. Wood smoke. Rosemary. Inside the cabin, a bright fire crackled cheerfully inside the stone fireplace. A heavy iron stew pot gently simmered above glowing coals. Fresh biscuits rested beneath a clean linen towel. Wet gloves hung drying beside the hearth. Lanterns filled the room with warm golden light. Everything looked lived in. Everything looked peaceful. Bennett blinked twice. He looked toward his brother. "I don't understand." Neither did Asher. They had prepared themselves for tragedy. Instead, someone had laid an extra place at the dinner table. Before either brother could move, a calm woman's voice floated from another room. "If you're going to stand there all night, close the door. You'll let all the warmth out." The brothers instinctively turned. Footsteps approached. A woman stepped quietly into the main room, carrying folded blankets. She stopped when she saw them. She appeared around 30 years old. Long chestnut hair rested loosely over one shoulder. Her blue wool dress was simple but carefully mended. A cream shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Despite the circumstances, she didn't appear frightened, only tired, very tired. She studied both brothers for a long moment. "You must be Asher." Then she looked toward Bennett. "And you're the younger one." Bennett frowned. "How do you know our names?" Instead of answering, she walked toward the fireplace and adjusted another log. The flames brightened immediately. Only then did she look back. "Gideon talks about you." Both brothers stared. Asher finally found his voice. "Where is he?" She hesitated. Out. Out. In this storm?" "He left before dawn." "For what?" Her eyes settled on the untouched stew pot. "For people who still haven't made it home." Bennett exchanged an uneasy glance with his brother. "He's been gone all day?" She nodded once. "He insisted. I told him no one should be traveling." He smiled. She almost laughed. "He said somebody out there would be saying exactly the same thing." The room fell silent again. Asher slowly removed his coat. "If Gideon's alive, why wasn't there any smoke when we arrived?" She pointed upward. "The wind. It pushes everything east." Only then did they notice faint smoke streaming sideways beyond the roofline, hidden by the blizzard. Later that evening, the brothers finally accepted bowls of stew. Neither realized how hungry they had become. The woman quietly poured coffee without asking questions. Bennett looked around the cabin. Everything had changed. The floor had been swept, curtains repaired, broken chair mended. Fresh pine branches decorated the mantel. Even Gideon's old cast-iron kettle had been polished. "You did all this?" She looked slightly embarrassed. "It helped pass the time." "You've been here long?" "For days." Asher lowered his spoon. "Gideon never mentioned anyone." "He couldn't." She smiled gently. "We only met because my supply wagon overturned during the first snowfall. He found me before nightfall and brought me here." Her voice softened. "He probably saved my life." Just then, 3 sharp knocks echoed against the cabin door. Everyone looked up. Another knock followed, heavier this time. The woman slowly smiled. "I imagine. That's him." The brothers were already on their feet before the latch even turned. The cabin door swung open. A gust of snow swept inside before the figure standing outside pushed it closed with one broad shoulder. Gideon Hale stamped the snow from his boots, a bundle of firewood balanced on one arm and 2 canvas sacks slung over the other. His beard was white with frost. His coat was buried beneath fresh snow. For a heartbeat, he simply stared. "Asher." "Bennett." Neither brother answered. They crossed the room at the same time. Bennett wrapped his older friend in a crushing embrace before Gideon could even set the sacks down. "You impossible old mule. We thought." His voice broke. "We thought we'd lost you." Gideon smiled faintly. "I've been called worse." Asher gripped his shoulder. "The whole town believes you're dead." "I was too busy staying alive to hear the rumors." The tension that had gripped the brothers for days finally cracked. Bennett laughed. Then, unexpectedly, so did Gideon. Even Corinne smiled from beside the stove. For the first time since the storm began, the cabin felt less like a lonely refuge and more like a home. Once dry clothes had replaced frozen ones, Gideon spread a rough map across the table. "There are still families stranded." He pointed towards several narrow valleys. "The Mercer brothers made it home yesterday. The Daltons are safe. But the Kellum place worries me." Asher frowned. "They're nearly 12 miles deeper into the pass." "I know. The road disappeared 2 days ago." Gideon nodded. "Which is why I'll leave before sunrise." Bennett stared at him. "You just got back." "I also just confirmed there are still people waiting." Corinne quietly placed another bowl of stew in front of Gideon. He thanked her before continuing. "I found 2 trappers yesterday. They'd burned every piece of furniture they owned trying to stay warm. And this morning, a widow and her elderly father. They hadn't eaten since Monday." The brothers exchanged uneasy glances. "You gave them supplies." It wasn't a question. Gideon simply nodded. Asher looked toward the nearly empty pantry. "You gave away your own food." "We'll manage." "You don't know that." Gideon smiled. "I know enough." Corinne finally spoke. "He always leaves saying he'll be careful. He always comes back carrying less than he left with." Later that evening, the storm eased enough for everyone to sit quietly before the fire. Bennett noticed an old framed photograph resting on the mantel. It showed a smiling teenage girl standing beside a much younger Gideon. He picked it up carefully. "I've never seen this one." The room became noticeably quieter. Gideon stared into the flames. "My sister." Bennett gently returned the frame. I didn't know there was a picture. There wasn't. I found it last year inside my mother's Bible. Corinne looked toward him. You never told me. He smiled sadly. I don't tell many people. Silence settled over the cabin. Finally, Gideon spoke again. We were both young. There was another winter like this. He watched the fire instead of the people listening. Our father became stranded checking fences. I rode out looking for him. My sister insisted on following. I told her to stay. She didn't. His voice lowered. The storm separated us. We found father. But he swallowed hard. We found my sister the following morning. No one interrupted. No one knew what to say. I spent years believing I should have searched differently. Faster. Smarter. I kept asking myself the same question. What if I'd turned left instead of right? The fire popped softly. Eventually I realized I couldn't change that winter. But maybe. He looked toward the snow-covered window. I could keep another family from living through it. The following morning the brothers woke before sunrise. Corinne already stood at the stove. Fresh biscuits baked inside the iron oven. Coffee filled the room with its rich aroma. She had somehow stretched the remaining flour into enough breakfast for everyone. Bennett looked around in amazement. I could have sworn there wasn't enough food for another day. There wasn't. She smiled. So I changed the recipe. He laughed. You keep performing miracles. No. I simply dislike waste. She pointed toward neatly folded blankets drying beside the fireplace. While everyone slept, I repaired every torn quilt. Asher blinked. When, during the night, you should have rested. She shrugged lightly. I sleep better when my hands are busy. Gideon watched the exchange quietly. He'd spent years believing survival depended entirely upon strength. Watching Corinne, he began realizing that survival often depended upon entirely different gifts. Kindness, patience, steady hands, quiet determination. She never demanded attention. She simply noticed what needed doing, and did it. Near midday, another knock echoed through the cabin. This one sounded urgent. Sheriff Hollis Brandt stumbled inside, covered in snow. His horse stood trembling outside. They found another empty wagon. Everyone stood. Where? North Ridge, near Widow's Creek. Hollis removed his gloves. There should have been 3 people traveling. We found the wagon. We found the horses. But no sign of the family. The room fell silent. They may have reached shelter, Asher suggested. They may have. The sheriff shook his head. Or they may still be out there. Every eye slowly turned toward Gideon. He already understood. He looked toward the window where fresh snow had begun falling again. Corinne stepped closer. You don't have enough daylight. I know. You've barely rested. I know. She sighed quietly. I suppose nothing I say will stop you. A gentle smile crossed Gideon's weathered face. You already know the answer. She disappeared briefly into the pantry. When she returned, she handed him a carefully wrapped bundle. Bread, dried meat, herbal tea, and your scarf, she added. You always forget it. The brothers exchanged knowing smiles. Something had changed inside the cabin. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Gideon accepted the bundle. Our fathers used to say surviving winter was about having good horses. He looked toward Corinne. I think they were only half right. She smiled. And the other half. He opened the cabin door. The people waiting when you come home. With that, Gideon stepped once more into the blizzard, unaware that the greatest rescue of the winter might not be the families he was searching for, but the lonely heart he had unknowingly begun to heal. The storm returned before sunrise. Not with the wild violence of the previous days, but with the slow, relentless snowfall that buried roads 1 quiet inch at a time. Gideon had barely disappeared beyond the pines when Sheriff Hollis saddled another horse. I'm riding with him. So am I, Asher said. Bennett was already tightening his saddle blanket. No arguments. Within minutes, the 3 men vanished into the white horizon. Corinne watched until they disappeared completely. Only then did she quietly close the cabin door. She looked around the empty room. The fire still burned. The stew still simmered. Fresh bread cooled beneath a linen cloth. She smiled to herself. If they're determined to save everyone else, someone has to make sure they have somewhere worth returning to. Hours passed. Snow continued falling. Corinne repaired another heavy coat while listening to the wind. Then she noticed something outside. An elderly neighbor struggled through the snow, pulling a small hand sled. Without hesitation, Corinne hurried outside. The woman introduced herself as Miriam Cross. I'm trying to reach the Mercer place. My grandson has medicine there. Corinne looked toward the deepening snow. You'll never reach it alone. Miriam lowered her eyes. I know, but I have to try. Corinne glanced back toward Gideon's cabin, then toward the nearly full pantry. She made her decision. Within minutes, she packed bread, dried meat, herbs, blankets, and a lantern onto the sled. Together, the two women slowly disappeared into the storm. Meanwhile, nearly 8 miles north, Gideon spotted something unusual. A strip of blue fabric caught beneath a pine branch. He climbed down immediately. Someone came this way. Fresh tracks disappeared beneath drifting snow. The 4 men followed them through dense timber. Nearly half an hour later, they found the missing family. A husband, his wife, and her elderly uncle. All 3 had taken shelter beneath an overhanging rock after their wagon axle shattered. Their fire had gone out hours earlier. The older man could barely stand. We thought, the husband whispered weakly, no one would find us. Gideon knelt beside him. We didn't come to lose anybody today. Asher and Bennett quickly wrapped the travelers in spare blankets. Sheriff Hollis prepared the horses. Working together, they slowly began the journey back toward the valley. By late afternoon, they reached the Mercer homestead. Warm smoke rose from the chimney. Every window glowed with welcoming light. Pastor Edwin stood outside waving. We've got room. Inside, neighbors had already gathered. Coffee brewed. Soup simmered. Fresh bread covered nearly every table. Someone had transformed the house into an emergency shelter. Gideon looked around in surprise. When did all this happen? Pastor Edwin smiled. You inspired people. What? Folks stopped waiting for someone else to help. They simply started helping. Sheriff Hollis chuckled. Turns out generosity spreads faster than gossip. The rescued family settled gratefully near the fireplace. For the first time in days, Gideon finally allowed himself to breathe. Then another familiar voice spoke behind him. I believe this belongs to you. He turned. Corinne stood quietly in the doorway. Snow still covered her cloak. She held out his wool scarf. He laughed softly. I forgot it again. I noticed. Then Gideon saw the empty sled behind her. Where did the food go? She hesitated. Several places. Miriam Cross stepped forward. This young lady walked halfway across the valley delivering supplies before anyone even knew we needed them. Another rancher nodded. My parents would have frozen without those blankets. And she never told anyone, someone else added. Corinne looked embarrassed by the attention. It wasn't important. Gideon smiled. It was. The blizzard finally broke 3 days later. For the first time in over a week, sunlight reached Silver Willow Crossing. Snow sparkled beneath a cloudless sky. People emerged from homes carrying shovels, laughter, and relief. The town square slowly filled with neighbors checking on one another. No one asked who had done the most. Everyone already knew. It hadn't been one person. It had been all of them, working together. Spring arrived gently. Snowmelt filled the streams. Wildflowers returned to the hills. At the annual Founders Gathering, Pastor Edwin stood before the assembled community. This winter reminded us of something. A town isn't measured by its buildings. It's measured by how its people care for one another. He invited Gideon forward. The cowboy looked uncomfortable beneath everyone's applause. I'm no hero, he said honestly. I simply did what anyone should. Pastor Edwin smiled knowingly. Perhaps, but someone had to be first. The applause grew louder. Then Gideon turned toward Corinne. He reached into his pocket and removed an old iron key. Several people exchanged curious glances. He handed it to her. She looked puzzled. The cabin, he said. It's too important to belong to just one person anymore. She looked up. What do you mean? I'd like us to keep it open every winter. For travelers. For families caught in storms. For anyone needing warmth. Her eyes filled with quiet tears. You trust me with that? I already do. 1 year later, another fierce winter storm swept across the Bitterroot Mountains. Snow covered the trails once more. A lone rider struggled through the darkness before finally spotting something in the distance. A warm light, smoke rising steadily from a familiar stone chimney. He urged his tired horse forward. Before he could knock, the cabin door opened. Gideon stood there smiling. Behind him came the rich smell of fresh stew, warm bread, burning firewood. Corinne looked up from the kitchen with the same gentle smile she had worn the day the brothers first found the cabin. Without asking questions, she placed another bowl on the table. Gideon stepped aside. Come in. The stew's hot. The fire's warm. And there's always room for one more. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage. Inside, the little mountain cabin glowed brighter than ever. It was no longer simply Gideon's home. It had become a promise. A promise that no traveler, no stranger, and no lonely soul would ever have to face another winter alone. And in the quiet warmth of that cabin, where fear had once been replaced by hope, two people who met because of a storm discovered that the greatest shelter was never the roof over their heads. It was the life they had built together.